can I introduce and possibly present something that has actually been about an 8-year journey. So it's been taking me down many roads. So this is, I don't want to say this is the end of the journey, it's the beginning of a new journey. And thank you for this opportunity. So I'm going to try with this to, hopefully by the end of this, or I'm hoping that my document explains what that image is really all about. That's really what I'm trying to explain, which is really about bringing people into a social context to show the process that I believe is happening to all of humanity around the world. But what I'm trying to do with this presentation is to remove some of the save the world stuff, you know. So if I start going off on that, please keep me focused on why we're here today. But still, I do want to say that microscale development impacts are affecting us in ways that we've never seen before. And I was trying to think of a way to, what is a key word that I could use to really explain what this is about. So when I'm looking up changing and looking up other things, I found the word transmuting. And I think it's an appropriate word because it's, people say that life has always changed and the world has always changed, but in my, really I vehemently believe that the changes that the human society is going through at this time are like something that human beings have never experienced before. And I'm still getting into the root of that, but I think it has to do with technology, it has to do with globalism, it has to do with many things. Rather than reading off a slide, this is really what I'm talking about. And but we as a global community are for sure at a pivotal point in our history. These decisions that we've been making for a long time are starting to compound. And while maybe for a long period of time, we humans have been able to live in our own little pockets and our own little worlds now, not only with globalism, but just with the overall impacts on our environment, I believe that we're all beginning to feel this and beginning to wake up, hopefully before it's not too late. So I am convinced that while humans may predominantly believe that nature is something external, like all other human beings, we are not separate from nature's laws and cycles. Oftentimes you talk about nature as though it's some external force, and I tend to believe that that is really the root of the primary issue. Somewhere along the lines, maybe with the agricultural revolution, I'm not sure, but somewhere around the lines we've disconnected ourselves from nature. So if traditional wisdom, our intrinsic connection with nature, becomes lost, then what hope is there for any of our survival? And that's really what I'm trying to do with this work and why we have these candles set up today. It's not to create an ambiance of romance, but to take a moment's pause to just sit around and be around this element of fire, of nature, of earth, of air, of ether that really make up all of us. So essentially, this is really something that I came across years ago, maybe 5 years ago, when I was doing some field work. I was in one of my first villages and saw, this was on a wall, this image here, and I thought this was kind of inspiring because it's really what simplified what this is all about. So only after the last tree has been cut down, and only after the last river has been poisoned, only after the last fish has been caught, only then will you find out that money cannot be eaten. And that is, I believe, what is happening around the world. I don't believe that human beings naturally want to destroy our environment. So, in setting out for years trying to, not prove in a sense, but I believe that this time in the world, and maybe this temporal window is closing where we can go into these, what we might call traditional societies. In other words, people that are still living, I don't want to say in harmony with their natural environment, because as I've gotten further in my journey, I realized that that's not necessarily the case. But when I first set out to do this in about 2010, I had that belief system. But I still believe that for a window of time, and I have observed through my own journey that we can still go in and see people living in different eras of human existence. And I'll explain my methodology later of how I go about doing that. But I feel, especially since coming to Donghua, why did I come here? Because I needed some, not too outside of the bubble that I've been in Thailand, but kind of on its periphery to get some tools and try to find a way to, rather than this be a journalistic adventure as it was in the beginning, to try to combine our environment with our human aspect. So this is why combining environmental science with social science, we can intimately link humans inextricable, which means inability to disconnect connection with nature. So, and then shifting the development conversation to being about our overall human condition. So oftentimes development is seen as this thing where we're building something. But this is why I'm focusing on the B, what's being taken away, what's it being replaced with. And I think that by illustrating our human condition, then we can start to take a look at how we're all in this together, and also how we can provide community-centered solutions regarding the issues that humanity is facing. How can we all talk about changing a global scale issue if we're not all on the same page of what that global issue actually is that pertains to all of us? This is what I'm talking about. And I think that this empathetic understanding can make that link. So, some objectives. This thesis aims to conjoin social capital building, civil documentary journalism, and storytelling, and the academic lenses of environmental and social science. That's why the document is engineered the way that it is. It's not, I know it's not a typical academic presentation, but I want to put them together. And the ultimate objective is to investigate how changes in physical environment affect relationships amongst ourselves and with our natural world. Because it's our environment that largely dictates our behavior. You know, we're having this conversation because of this environment. I want to analyze how the village is connected with the urban areas and the road and the globalized connectivity, and how this impacts people's behavior as a holistic unit. And then overlay the community's development process impacts over a period of time, and how the socio-ecological systems have changed, and mostly reveal about modern day human condition. That's the point, that's the purpose. So as the context, why Thailand? Well, first of all, I ended up there. I had to figure something out, but I don't want to go off on a tangent of how this happened, but I see that part of the world, at least I did, more so before, as like the periphery of globalization. So it's on the edge of the development paradigm, unlike the United States where I come from, right? These processes have long taken place, and this is a perfect environment for that. Now that's changing, that's closing as well. I think the most important about this is that all of the encompassing countries of Thailand were formerly colonized, and ever since going to Thailand in 2010, sitting in front of a 7-Eleven, I never believed that the place was never colonized. But I'm hoping that with chapter 2 of this document, doing an investigative, that I took all last year, 2 classes, and also about 1 year of digging up information through and trying to kind of prove, in a sense, that the country was taken over. And the important part about that, why did I focus on, everyone says Thailand's never been colonized. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, and that's a whole nother discussion. But when I dig in deeper, in that fine line between colonization and imperialization, I have without a doubt that the country was imperialized, stage 1, and the second stage was that it was internally developed. And why do I focus on this? Because this is the policy base that has been and is being used to control the land underneath the people's feet that I'm trying to look at as a societal context. So it's not even so much about colonization and imperialization, it's about territorialization. So the territorialization of the people and of the land through the people, and the people through the land. I hope this is making sense. Once I discovered about the Bowring Treaty, it was really quite fascinating, because the Bowring Treaty, as I illustrated in there, territorialized 80% of Siam's property at that time. So without going into a big talk about this, that impact of the Bowring Treaty in 1855, mostly with the creation of the state park system, the creation of the Ministry of Interior and the State Thai Forestry Department. These are the ways that the central government used policy to control what people do. And this process is still taking place now. And that process is maturing and closing. But so initially the land was colonized, it was imperialized, and then later it was internally developed mostly through the Royal Project. Everyone stays away from the Royal Project. No one wants to talk about the Royal Project. It's sacred territory. But I felt that it's really important to talk about the Royal Project because this is the internal development. This is the creation of a Thai nation state that arguably was created so that it could engage in the global market system. So I talk about territorialization. It's creating units. So you create a nation unit and you create a village unit, you create a person unit. And if those units are not put into blocks that can fit in with the system that the whole global market system fits into, then how can it operate? I want to shut up for a little while and just show just a 5-minute video to show what I'm talking about.
Just take a moment's pause, right? And take a look at people who still represent something that's inherent to human beings. We're all living creatures for that matter. And we can just take a moment's pause just to think about the value of our heritages, the value of our cultures, the value of our ability and capacity to live in community and with one another, and I'll use the word regulated by our natural environment. I think that has a lot of value, a lot of potential.
Together, we are about to travel to locations rarely seen by the public eye, up to the high mountains of northern Thailand. There, communities of indigenous peoples have for generations been living relatively traditional lives. Their unique cultures are vanishing, however, as they, like those in the urban areas below them, are becoming ever more part of a modernizing trend. Global market forces and government policies are in a sense forcing villagers to shove centuries of indigenous knowledge aside and adopt modernized, developed lifestyles in order to survive. They are trying their best to maintain traditional ways while adapting to an encroaching modern world that is pulling them in one television program at a time. However, as the village elders are fading away, their indigenous knowledge with them, the middle-aged community members want to preserve the culture for which they feel responsible but may not know how, and the younger generations are looking to a world outside of the village for examples of how to survive in a modern world society. Many of these communities overall are amid a very tangible identity crisis, and their future is uncertain. This is a global issue. The future of humankind is also uncertain, as the economic market-related decisions that humans have been making for generations are rendering like never before very tangible effects on our reality in terms of our natural environment and overall social functioning. If we are going to find creative solutions to global challenges, then let's focus on the root of prominent global issues. What is transpiring in developing parts of the world has long since happened in first world developed, supposedly more advanced societies, namely, issues related to environmental degradation, material acquisition, economic inequality, and poverty. Here we must prioritize, what do we humans really want? For ourselves, our neighbors, and especially for our future generations. This project focuses on the D of the word development. What are development-related processes taking away from what is essentially the essence of humankind? Our unique cultures, our traditional ways of life, our connection with nature. What are the replacements, both negative and positive? This project is proposing that more traditional cultures, particularly those of indigenous peoples, whose communities represent a nature intrinsic to us all, can potentially serve as a contemporary social scientific measurement of how all of humankind has been affected at our core by modern development-related phenomena. This conversation can be initiated by remembering where all of us really come from, and it isn't the city. We can begin by listening to indigenous voices from an age range and from different ethnicities, and about how their communities have been impacted by modern economic development. Here are some of these voices.
It's challenging sometimes to really box up and talk where's my heart in this? Sometimes people, like, this is an anthropological study. It's not necessarily an anthropological study. When I first moved to Thailand, development at the time was had a different meaning to me. I come from an area of the world where, cutting down trees and putting up a big building and filling it full of stuff is seen as progress. When I moved to a place like northern Thailand and I started seeing rice paddies being filled in with concrete and putting pink condominium complexes, it flipped around. So I started looking at this deed. So when this got deeper and deeper, as my experience got deeper and deeper into more of a journey, a serious journey, I had to think about how am I going to put this together in terms of questions. So this is why I say, what are development and modernization related processes taking away from human culture and traditional ways of life, right? It wasn't until later I learned that development and modernization are two different things, a part of the same schema. But what are the short and potential long-term impacts of status quo development processes? What can be done in the earlier stages, right? And then later learning, people talk about alternative development, like sustainable tourism, right? Is it sustainable really possible? Is alternative really possible? And I whipped through the literature review a little bit, but this was really a pivotal book for me to read, thankfully suggested by Professor Thai, because this book really allowed me to understand what is development in the definitional sense of what is its motivation from the colonization point of view, right? From the Western center of power point of view. So when he talked about Peterzi talks about development as an organized intervention in collective affairs according to a standard improvement, after 5 or 6 years when I read that sentence and I'm trying to figure out what the heck that means, I had to break it up into pieces. And to me, organized intervention is about social policy, right? How can the state control people? They do it through social policy. And collective affairs is about culture and standard of improvement. What I'm trying to get at here is about when the West comes into a place like Southeast Asia in 1850, maybe it started around 1815 or something around there. They're saying that this is a better way to live life, but in reality, it's kind of more about we're going to change your social fabric so that it fits our market system and our government system. But what's important is Peterzi talks about in the age of globalization, local culture represents the last treasure trove. I think this puts my work into context. The indigenous peoples are the last custodians of paradise. I don't know about paradise, but lost to late capitalism, ecological devastation. With ecological pressures gaining worldwide, this phenomenon is gaining ground as it is queuing up for the last exit. This is the point. So what are some frameworks that I used? I looked at the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, also looking at planetary theory. So what really is ecosystem services is about the plant and microorganisms, animal communities, basically the Earth's ecosystem unit that provides for the things that we need for survival. But there's also an economic element of that. And panarchy is the cycle of life. So this study involves the data from 2010 to 2018. I was mostly assisted by a Thai researcher, is Tanya Pombran. She's been doing work in these communities for about 15 years. I presented my initial idea for this in 2012, and she believed in it and had the social capital and the professional expertise to be able to bring me into these communities where I could do my thing. So qualitative and quantitative analysis, I do structured and semi-structured interviews, a lot of observation. It wasn't my job to go there and study every little aspect of their culture. I really wanted to be an observer, at least until now, and to try to understand a little bit from the exterior and asking questions when I needed to ask questions and get information that I specifically needed for specific things. And I feel that that's been accomplished at this point. Now I'm going on to do my PhD to be different. The purpose of this approach is to gain insight into some of the effects. And why did I look at, so I looked at these, I decided, okay, how can I figure this out? I'm going to go into low, medium, and at that time, and I still do view it as a development continuum. Anthropologists might particularly say, no, everything's different, there is no Klein. I don't believe that. I went into these different villages on different stages of what I view as a development continuum, and I wanted to look at villagers from a different age range. I initially went out to set out about different ethnicities, and then I abandoned that because I realized that it's not so important about the ethnicity. They're all responding to the same phenomenon in different ways that is linked with their particular culture. So I talked to people from 14 to 84 years old, and I thought that that was a way to gain a really broad understanding of how different people from different human psyches, eras of viewpoints of the world could teach me about what's happening.
I was very happy after moving from Burma to this village 37 years ago. We were one of 3 households living here at the time. It was very quiet. Life was good. I worked in the tea plantation. I lived simply, growing rice and collecting food from the forest. I didn't have to buy anything, just salt. Now I have to buy nearly everything, including vegetables. Villagers, for the most part, just don't live the Lahu way of life anymore. It's just not the same. Everything feels different, except during the New Year's celebration. Many things are changing. People are becoming more selfish, thinking if they do things with others, that there will be less for themselves in the end. The cultural harmony isn't as it was. What will come of this village and the Lahu people? I don't know. I'm not a god.
So these are the villages. I went to the primary villages, but this Pumun is the primary case study. It's on the Thai-Burma border. There's 2 villages there. One has been there for 140 years. The other one was developed in the 70s. I mostly focus on the one that was developed in the 70s, the one on the left. And just kind of speeding this up a little bit. So for 5 years, I went in and talked to villagers about these. It was a pretty broad scanning of topics. I'm going in and trying to talk to them about development impacts, but I realized very quickly that most of them had never really thought about that. So why am I not getting answers when I say, "How do you think about your village being developed?" What? So I had to figure out at that time that they haven't thought about this, because a lot of them are in survival mode too, right? Anyway, a lot of this information my colleague extracted. Maybe 3 years prior, she had done interviews there as a Thai government researcher. The government wanted to put community-based tourism in there. So she was sent up there for 2 years to figure out what's going on there. And so I was able to interview her on different layers, and then we went in together and started looking at what are some of the factors, what are some of the things in relation to socio-composition, economy, natural environment, and how have these things changed over time. And when I put all this into this model, I saw, kind of proving my own, what I was thinking was correct in the beginning, a hypothesis, that as things go in this way and you look at it down that way, you can see, I'm not saying that life was like heaven for them up there, we don't know. But all I know is that you can see a climb of what I perceive as degradation, or maybe that's a judgment. It's a climb of change that's happened in that community. And so to kind of link up with the idea of this cycle of life, and one cycle coming to a point and then building up and sustaining and collapsing and rebuilding, I think that there's been 3 main points of primary change in this village community area. And that's in the 1880s, when Britain was colonizing Burma. It forced these people to migrate. They came to here. That's one societal system state change. 1950s is when the land use regulations came, after the Thai state was created. And that completely transformed everything. And then 2005 is when the infrastructure started coming in. So that's when the low power electricity. So these are, and there's been sub changes obviously within these 70 years. It's about 70-year period of time, blocks of time, which I think is also interesting. It's indicator. So going back, I had created this site created 3-4 years ago. It's been updated now with new data from this year. But trying to put this into some kind of model to make sense, I wanted to go in, look at these same factors, pull these factors out of this development timeline and put them into the ecosystem services model. So by looking at supporting, provisioning, regulating, and cultural services, extracting these out, not so much still putting them within the date ranges, within these life cycles, but breaking them up. And then I think we can talk more about this in the discussion. But then I realized, after I created all of this, that's a lot of information. When I got to the end of that, I'm feeling, I did it. It took 2 weeks, and okay, now I have to visualize this. It's too much. So I figured out with my Thai colleague, with Tanya. Her speciality is quantitative analysis. So I said, I need to evaluate these. We need to figure this out. So we took all of these factors. There's 44 factors. And I we think about the trend changes. So this isn't about like measuring fish or babies. It's just about trends to illustrate the things that are happening in the community. And those trends can be used for discussion. They can be used for many things, right? But this is all within the ecosystem services model. So we took those factors and I had to label it somehow, so I called it an ecosystem service factor intensity. And what that means is it's the prominence of that particular factor at that time. So if it's a 20, it just means that biodiversity was low at that time or something like that. And I'll explain more. This, I think maybe in the discussion we can go through each one of these. But maybe that would be better. So I just took all of these regulating services and we graphed them. We figured out a way to graph them, which was super exciting because I had never done anything like this before. And so we graphed all of these different trends. Later we can talk about any of these factors that you want to talk about. Income, livelihood, recreational. These are all of the things within the framework of the ecosystem services model. And then we figured out a way to take all those, average it out, and put it into the human well-being. So this isn't the most important thing. Those factors are important, but what this is doing is illustrating the trends in the village. I would like to say right now that my initial model of creating this did not look like this. I mean, I've always known that the social relations have been degrading in the village, but cultural is kind of more my expertise. I'm not an environmental scientist, trying to become one more. But initially, when we wanted to, and I'll conclude after this. So I evaluated the scores based on what I believed was right? So we look at, biodiversity's increased, this is decreased, that's it. And Tanya also evaluated, and then we agreed on a score, and I created the chart. And it was weird because granted the good social relations was going down, everything else was going up. So I had come up with a conclusion at the end that's the opposite of this. So when we went back into the village, we thought, okay, I can't have this score be done by me and by her. We got to go back into the village. So I went back in there and talked to 3 different villagers of a not so much as a wide of an age range as I had hoped, but the eldest villager wasn't available on that day, but I have interviewed him before that, so he's still in the analysis. But it wasn't what we thought it was. When I started talking to the villagers about the environmental part about it, it's the opposite, and I'll talk about that in the discussion. I think what's important about this is some people say, well, how do you know what happened in 1880? Right? There's no one there who's 140 years old that can talk about that. But every villager I talked to over the years, and in many other villages, through oral tradition, they all indicate that is around where it was. I don't think it's so important. I think the most important part is 1950s when the land use regulations came in. And it was nice when I repopulated all the charts and got rid of all my evaluations. All of these changed. They don't go down like this. They're very gradual, and I think it's more reasonable. So when I started getting numbers like 43, 27, 86, and the numbers changed, I think it's more reasonable, at least to take a look at how everything's degrading. But I think also what's most important is where are those lines going to? If these are about 70-year blocks of time, I realized later that these cycles are happening. So can we reasonably say that in the future these are what happens when those intersect? They've never intersected. Well, I guess they've intersected there, maybe in the 1930s, right, when the Thai state was created. Anyway, how to analyze this chart? This is where I need help with. Right? So, in conclusion, this research project was meant to delve into how we as a global community at a pivotal point in our history, I think we all know it. It's possible that global scale calamity is upon us, but at the same time, while this is happening, there's great innovation that's happening like never before. So I don't have a negative viewpoint on the future too much. Rural agrarian communities can offer us a societal context for focusing on the idea of development. But the thing is that capitalism's exploitive nature is actually predestined to detrimentally impact the environment. It's set up this way. It's set up on a perpetual cycle of growth. How can if something set up on a perpetual cycle of growth be sustainable when it's meant to collapse and push capital into other parts of the world? Central state development policies are in many ways actually most useful for controlling resources and growing the capitalism-driven GDP. This is rather than for development's explicit purpose of solving problems and nourishing civil society by providing more choices. I think looking at definitions is really important. You can really provide that framework. So, yeah, okay, it solves problems created by the very system that is said to solve these problems. Briefly, we can talk about this when we look at this chart and graph. The entire socio-environment and the natural environment around that community has been restored. But yet all of these things have gone down. and I'll talk about that in the discussion, but it's mostly because when the government said, okay, we're gonna stop opium production, stop your shift cultivation culture, stop all that, and replant the trees, apparently they brought in pine trees, and they brought in non-indigenous species that changed the ecosystem and killed a lot of their natural medicines, their fibers, everything. It completely changed the biodiversity of the area. And I think that's an analogy for, it also changed the diversity and it also of their socio-culture as well, their socio-fabric. So what this suggests then is that even rural communities remaining intertwined or linked with the nature that regulates them are experiencing now more than ever blatant and arguably dangerous, precarious, social degrading phenomenon. So when I think about that, okay, everybody who's gone into these villages and communities, you know this, but considering this context that people are still living in this edge of this, can you just imagine what the actual extent of the social degradation that's happened in like a place where I come from in the United States? If we look at this on a climb, right? These supposedly more advanced and civilized societies synonymous with progress. I just don't see it. This is perhaps because while organic goods can be distributed to materialism-driven societies, synthetics and their symbiotically linked modern livelihoods cannot be injected into an inherently agrarian society. They are just completely incompatible. It's like saying, you know, traditional and modern being, you put them together, how can you do that? Briefly, the UN Millennium Assessment says that ecosystem services have low-level bonds with good social relations. When I started looking into this deeper, I completely, vehemently disagree with that. That might be the case for people living in the centers of power. It might be the case for people living in a big city, but it's not the case for people living in these agrarian societies. They need each other for labor, they need each other for social relations, they need each other for survival. And going into particularly my case study area, and now they can't even necessarily get each other to help pick tea or help in another at all. They say, oh, give me money. It's just like what's happening in the West. The same system, the same phenomenon is happening as I saw in my hometown. That's what's happening. And okay, I want with this work to take a moment's pause and stop this before it's too late. So, when a society is cohesive, it can, through social unity and informed resilience, survive through the worst of calamities. I've seen this here, I've seen it in Bosnia, I've seen it in the US, I also saw it on the Thai-Burma border. It's the same type of thing. When people are brought together around the main thing that they hold dear, their social fabric, they can survive. So, diversity is needed. Societies require their traditional socio-fabric, updated and innovative development strategies are required. Local peoples must be consulted about things that are happening to them. And last one, I don't know, with each older generation, the modern world is losing their traditional socio-fabric with them through this development progress and a resulting homogenizing modern world. It's as though monumental segments of an ancient societal iceberg are sliding into the sea. So what happens when thousands of years of indigenous knowledge that's passed down through particularly the older generations, and they're not doing that anymore, and that knowledge is linked to our be able to survive on planet Earth, and that's cut? That's what's happening. That's why I refer to the iceberg sliding into the sea, because they cannot be replaced. So, humankind, as it always has, can determine its destiny. I do believe that. If people in these rural areas choose to live this way, then why can't other people choose to live this way? You know, in 2011, I'm going 1 hour from Chiang Mai, I'm on a motorbike, I'm in this traffic and the modern world and the chaos, and 1 hour later, I'm in a place where there's no electricity. People at that time were weird, funny dressed. Later I learned to see the beauty of it. And you see the contrast. So we choose to live in the city, they choose to live there. So I believe that humankind, as it always has, can determine its destiny. We can choose how we live, and certainly within the boundaries of our available resources. And I just have to say it, may we choose wisely.